There are names that have been eroded by time, turning into dust. There are also names that have been engraved on stone tablets, honored by posterity. But there is only one name in human history, engraved not in stone or gold, but in snake venom, in the whispers of sin, and in the darkest ink of decadence. That name, after 5 centuries, still makes people shudder when mentioned. Borgia. Why them? Why? Among the countless tyrants, greedy, and cruel families of the Renaissance, did history choose the Borgias to become the embodiment of evil? Were they really incestuous monsters, murderers with smiles, poisoners of the faith of humanity? Or is the truth much more complicated and terrifying? Perhaps the story of the Borgias is not the story of what they did, but of what we are want to believe they did. Perhaps they are just a mirror, reflecting back all our dark desires, fears, and hypocrisies. To understand the Borgia curse, we must do something paradoxical. Start not with their birth, but with the myth that buried them alive. Let us turn back the pages of history, not to retell an old story, but to decipher a curse. The curse of a family that became immortal, not through greatness, but through utter disgrace. History is written by the victors, but sometimes it is haunted by the losers. The Borgias not only failed to maintain their power, they failed so gloriously and spectacularly that their failure became their only legacy. The core question is not what did the Borgias do, but why is their story so powerful? Why did their shadow loom over an era, making their real crimes, terrible enough, pale in the face of an even more terrible legend? To answer this question, we must look into the mirror they left behind. That mirror reflects a world where the line between saint and devil is as thin as a thread. A world where the representative of God on earth can be the most sinful person. A world where angelic beauty can hide a heart of ice. And a world where family love can twist into something sick and possessive. The problem is not that the Borgias were unique. The problem is that they were too brazen. They brought their sins to light in an age that favored cover-ups and hypocrisy. They did not play by the rules. They rewrote them in blood and gold. And that brazenness made them the perfect target. Their enemies did not need to invent new crimes. They simply amplified the ones they already had, cloaking them in the mysterious and hideous cloak of incest, an accusation that could not be proven, but could not be washed away. That accusation became the ultimate weapon, transforming them from corrupt men into monsters, from sinners into symbols of the Antichrist. And so, history got the story it needed. A saga of the fall, a warning about absolute power. But is that the whole truth? Or are we, the audience 5 centuries later, still being mesmerized by a well-orchestrated drama? Every curse needs a sower, and the seeds of the Borgia curse were sown by the man who should have been the holiest man on earth. Rodrigo Borgia. Before he became the eye of the storm, he was the storm. A storm of ambition, intrigue, and a brazen lust for power. In 1492, when the cardinals met in secret to elect the successor of St. Peter, they were not looking for a saint. They were looking for the highest bidder. And Rodrigo, with his chests of Spanish gold piled high, did not hesitate to bet his fortune. He did not win their hearts with piety. He bought their souls with gold. The election, known as the conclave, was essentially an auction. And the winner, Rodrigo Borgia, ascended the throne as Alexander VI. He bought God, and from that moment on, the faith of Europe began to be bought and sold. This was the starting point, the fertile ground for all subsequent slander. The problem was not that Alexander VI was the first guilty pope. The history of the Vatican had seen greedy people with illegitimate children. But no one had dared to turn the apostolic palace into a private stage for his family like Alexander. He had blurred the boundary between the Holy See and the Borgia family. The walls that had once echoed with the sound of prayers now rang with the laughter of lovers. Giulia Farnese, the beautiful La Bella, was not only a publicly acknowledged lover, her image was also brazenly painted as the Virgin Mary in the rooms of the Vatican. It was an undisguised blasphemy, a slap in the face to all who still believed in the sacred. And then there were the children. Alexander's love for his children was genuine, but it was a calculating and selfish love. He saw them not as sins to be hidden, but as the sharpest tools to consolidate his power. Cesare, his eldest son, was made a cardinal as a teenager, a position he neither wanted nor deserved. Lucrezia, his jewel, was betrothed as a child, her hand a thread that bound political alliances. He turned his bastards into princes and princesses of the church, placing his bloodline above canon law. He did not merely break his vow of celibacy. He made it a point of pride. It was this openness, this shameless display, that created an inevitable psychological logic in the minds of the people of Rome and of Europe. They wondered, a man who dared to turn his mistress into the Virgin Mary, who dared to make an illegitimate son a prince of the church, a man who knew no limits in satisfying his desires. What was the last line he would not dare to cross? When a king disregards all laws, people begin to believe that he is capable of any crime. And in that context, whispers of incest began to arise. It did not come from evidence. It came from a logical inference. For a man like Alexander VI, nothing was impossible. He had destroyed with his own hands the mantle of respect and sanctity that protected the papacy. Now, with nothing to hide behind, he was completely exposed to rumors, and every ostentatious act of his only added credence to the rumors. From the sinful soil that Alexander VI had cultivated, a golden rose began to bloom. Lucrezia Borgia. History often paints her in two contrasting colors, either a lustful demon who seduced her own father and brother, or an innocent victim, a lamb pushed among wolves. But both portraits are too simple, too flat. To understand Lucrezia, we must see her not as a character, but as a product. She was the most perfect and tragic product of a sick power machine created by her own father. She was not born to live, she was born to serve. Her beauty was not a gift from nature. It was an asset, a tool, a currency worth more than gold. And from a young age, she was taught to understand her value on the political chessboard. Lucrezia's life was a series of exchanges. At the age of 13, she was married off to Giovanni Sforza, a powerful lord, to cement her father's northern alliance. The wedding was a lavish affair, but behind the silks and jewels, it was a cold transaction. Lucrezia, with her angelic face and trained composure, played her part. She was a dutiful bride, a young duchess. But when the political winds turned, when the alliance with the Sforzas no longer held any value, she was taken away like defective goods. The marriage was brutally and publicly annulled for humiliating reasons. Giovanni Sforza was declared impotent, unable to fulfill his marital duties. This was a brilliant and cruel move by the Borgias. Not only did it free Lucrezia for a more advantageous marriage, it also turned her ex-husband into a laughingstock for all of Italy, stripping him of all credibility. But let's look at the situation from Lucrezia's perspective. She had learned her first and most brutal lesson about the nature of power. She had learned that love, honor, and even a man's dignity could be crushed with a single decree from her father. She had seen the fragility of fate and the absolute power of deception. Could a young girl who had gone through such an event continue to be naive? Or had she begun to understand the rules of the game? Perhaps her silence and submissive appearance were not weakness, but a survival strategy. She was observing, learning, honing her mask to perfection. The question is not whether Lucrezia is guilty or innocent. The question is, what choice did she have? In a world where her father is the Pope, her brother is a murderer, and her own body is a political instrument, virginity is a luxury that does not exist. She was thrown into a mud puddle, and she had only two choices: sink or learn to walk on it without leaving footprints. Rumors of incest followed her like a shadow. People whispered that her father had broken off the engagement to keep her for himself. Their logic was simple. Why throw away a good deal if not to monopolize it? Lucrezia was caught in the middle. She was a symbol of her father's depravity, living proof of imagined sins. Her every move, her every smile, was viewed with suspicion. She is not a person. She is a symbol, a golden rose that grows from sin, beautiful but thorny, and perhaps also filled with poison. If Lucrezia was the golden rose on the chessboard, there was always a dark shadow hovering beside her, protecting her from all dangers, but also blocking her sunshine. That shadow had a name, Cesare Borgia. To understand the Borgias, one had to understand Cesare, because if his father was the brain, he was the sword. Cesare was a phenomenon of the times. A man who abandoned the cardinal's robes for armor, abandoned prayers for the sword. He was the embodiment of naked ambition, of an iron will that accepted no barriers, be they human or divine laws. But this complex man, this ruthless conqueror, had a weakness, or rather a single obsession: his sister Lucrezia. Their relationship was the center of all the rumors, the dark heart of the Borgia legend. On the surface, Cesare was a devoted brother. He escorted Lucrezia everywhere, his razor-sharp gaze scanning the crowd, ready to tear apart anyone who dared to look disrespectfully at her. He brushed aside suitors, purged those who dared to hurt her. But looked deeper, and that protection took on a different hue. It was not mere protection. It was possessiveness. In Cesari's eyes, Lucrezia was more than just a sister. She was a Borgia. She was part of him, the family's most precious possession, and therefore his to control. Anyone who approached her was not just a suitor, but an intruder, a threat to the order he had established. This pathological possessiveness is most brutally and clearly demonstrated in the fate of Alfonso of Aragon, Lucrezia's second husband. Unlike her political marriage to Giovanni Sforza, Lucrezia had found true happiness with Alfonso. He was a young, handsome prince, and most importantly, he truly loved her. For the first time in her life, Lucrezia lived as a woman, loved, cherished, and that happiness became Alfonso's death sentence. For Cesare, Lucrezia's happiness was a danger. Her love for Alfonso had created a new loyalty, a bond beyond his control. Lucrezia had a world of her own, a world in which Cesare was no longer the center. That was unacceptable, and so Alfonso was brutally murdered on the steps of the Vatican. All traces point to a single name. When confronted with the truth, Cesare might have justified his actions, and might have even told Lucrezia that it was to protect her from a political alliance that had run its course, to protect her from future pain. But that was the logic of evil. Cesare did not protect Lucrezia. He destroyed her happiness to regain control. He killed her love to prove that no one could possess her but him and the Borgias. He saved her from happiness, a cruel act in the name of love. It was this act that turned the whispers of incest into a roar. What kind of brother kills his sister's husband? One wonders. Unless he sees the husband not as a brother-in-law, but as a rival. Cesare, in his effort to protect the integrity of the Borgia family, has inadvertently provided the most convincing evidence for the darkest myth about his own family. If Cesare used the knife to establish control within his family, the Borgias took that control to a greater level, turning it into a gruesome performance art on the political stage of Rome. They understood that true power came not just from eliminating enemies, but from striking a permanent fear into the hearts of the living. And there was no more perfect stage for this display of terror than their lavish banquets. The Borgias' poison banquets are legendary, but to understand their cruelty, we must look at them not as assassinations, but as elaborate plays. Imagine you are a cardinal, a powerful noble in Rome. You receive an invitation to a banquet at the Apostolic Palace. To refuse would be an unthinkable insult, a declaration of war. So you put on your finest clothes and enter a candlelit hall, where the air is thick with the scent of roast meat, fine wines, and melodious music. Pope Alexander VI greets you with a warm smile, his laughter echoing throughout the room. Lucrezia, beautiful as a goddess, nods to you with deadly grace. Cesare sits in a corner, silent as a panther, his eyes scanning every face. Everything seems perfect, a night of luxury and friendship. But deep down, you and everyone else there hold your breath. You are careful with every glass of wine, every bite of cake. Your heart pounds every time a servant approaches. Because, this is more than just a party. It's a game of Russian roulette, and the bullet could be in any dish. This was the brutal genius of the Borgias. They could have killed their enemies in a dark alley. But that was too simple, too inoffensive. Poisoning a man in the middle of the banquet, in front of dozens of powerful witnesses, sent a different message. It said, "We can kill you anytime, anywhere, even when you are at the height of your fame, surrounded by your friends. We can weaponize hospitality, turn smiles into death masks. And after you fall, twitching on the floor, the music will continue, and we will toast to the health of those who remain. We are above the law. We are the law." Each such banquet was a purge and a coronation for fear. When a wealthy cardinal suddenly died of indigestion, his fortune was immediately seized, flowing into the Borgia treasury to finance Cesari's wars. The survivors returned home, not with a sense of relief, but with a deep sense of horror. They had seen firsthand the fragility of life and the absolute power of the Borgias. The next time the Pope needed a vote, or Cesare needed more troops, they would not dare refuse. And in this theater of fear, Lucrezia played a particularly important role. Her beauty and composure in the midst of such a scene of death added to the horror. Her serenity made one wonder, was she a cold-blooded accomplice, or a soul so hardened that death no longer moved her? Either way, her presence legitimizes the play, turning a massacre into a social event. It is the height of decadence, turning death into performance art. An empire built on fear and betrayal always has one fatal flaw. It is completely dependent on the tyrant at its head. The Borgias, at the height of their power, thought themselves immortal. But they had forgotten a cruel law of the universe. You reap what you sow. The curse they had unleashed on Rome, the weapon they had wielded so ruthlessly, had finally found its way home. In the summer of 1503, the air in Rome was unusually stifling and sultry, as if the city itself were holding its breath, waiting for a fateful event. And that event came not from an invading army, but from inside a glass of wine or from a mosquito bite. The story of Alexander VI's death is one of history's greatest mysteries, a drama of bitter irony. One August evening, Alexander and Cesare dined at the villa of Cardinal Adriano de Corneto. The plan, according to many rumors, was a familiar one: to poison their host cardinal and seize his vast fortune. They had brought a bottle of poison wine, the family's famous Canarella. But in a moment of carelessness, a fatal mistake, or perhaps a stroke of fate, the Borgias themselves drank the poisoned wine meant for someone else. Another theory is that the host cardinal, aware of their intentions, struck first. Or, more simply, but no less dramatically, all three of the most powerful men in the Vatican were struck down by malaria, the fever of Rome that makes no distinction between saints and sinners. Whatever the cause, the result was a perfect tragedy. Alexander VI, the man who had once ruled Europe, who had once sat on a throne judging the fates of millions, now lay writhing in agony. Fever and poison, or both, had taken their toll. His body, once draped in lavish ceremonial robes, had swollen, disfigured, and turned so horribly black so soon after death that servants had to force him into the coffin. To the people of Rome, it was no natural death. It was clear evidence of divine punishment, or that his soul had been claimed by the devil. The curse had been fulfilled. The one who inflicted death by poison had finally died of it. The fall was not limited to the Pope. Cesare, the invincible warrior, the sword of the Borgias, fell to the same disease. He did not die, but the disease took all his strength at the most crucial moment. He could only lie on his sickbed, helplessly listening to the news of his father's death, helplessly watching as the empire they had built with blood and intrigue began to crumble. Alexander VI was not just Cesari's father. He was the source of all his power. He was the sun, and when the sun went down, the planets around him lost their light and direction. As soon as the news of the Pope's death spread, the vultures that the Borgias had temporarily banished began to return. Their enemies, the Orsini, the Colonna, and especially the Della Rovere, immediately took action. The power of the Borgias, built on a single man, collapsed overnight. Alexander's death was not just the end of a life, it was the end of an era, the disintegration of an empire from within. As the central fire of the Borgia Empire burned out, its ashes flew in opposite directions, taking with them the fates of its two remaining children. The story of those who survived the fall is more tragic and poignant than the fall itself. It reveals how fragile the Borgias' true power was, and how, with the facade of Pope Alexander VI gone, they were left naked before a world hungry for revenge. The paths of Cesare and Lucrezia, two halves of one sinful soul, now diverged fatefully. Cesare's path was a long slide from the heights of glory to the depths of disgrace. The wolf of Romagna, who had once made kings and city-states tremble, now found his fangs broken. Illness had held him at his most dangerous moment, but it was the hostility of the world that finished him off. The family's greatest enemy, Cardinal Giuliano della Rovere, had become Pope Julius II. It was the end. Julius II had no intention of forgiving or forgetting. Cesare, once master of Italy, was now a political prisoner. He was stripped of his lands, betrayed by his former allies. The Spanish general Gonzalo de Córdoba, who had fought at his side, was now his captor and turned him over to the King of Spain. From a conquering prince, Cesare became an exile, imprisoned in the cold fortresses of Spain. But even in that situation, the Borgia fire in him did not die. He made a spectacular escape, a last flash of the daring and talent that had made his name. But for what? The world had changed. Without a father, without an army, without power, he was just a fearsome but empty name. Cesare's death did not come in a grand battle, not at the hands of a worthy opponent. He fell in a small skirmish in Navarre, killed by the spear of an unknown soldier. The wolf died not with a roar, but with a pitiful whimper. It was an ironic and cruel end to an extraordinary life, one who had lived by the sword and despised fate, and ended up as an unknown man, forgotten by fate itself. Meanwhile, in Ferrara, Lucrezia took a different path, the path of survival. Her marriage to Duke Alfonso d'Este, another of her father's political moves, had now become her lifeline. It had lifted her out of the storm of Rome before it collapsed. From afar, she had heard of her father's death, of her brother's fall from grace and tragic end. What had she done? She had dressed Cesare in mourning and prayed for his soul. But there was nothing she could do. She was trapped. She was a Borgia, but she was also the Duchess of Ferrara, mother of the d'Este heirs. She could not return to the past, nor could she escape it entirely. Lucrezia chose to live. She shed her role as the Pope's daughter, the Lord's sister, and took on a new one, that of a pious duchess, a patron of the arts, a loving mother. She spent the remaining years of her life building a new legacy, one of benevolence and cultural patronage, as if trying to cover up the sinful foundations of her family with beautiful bricks. But the ashes of the empire still clung to her. She survived, but at the cost of carrying the burden of a cursed name for the rest of her life. She was the last of a legend, a lone survivor amid the ashes of a glorious and sinful empire. And so, after passing through gilded palaces, poisoned banquets, and anonymous graves, we return to the question that started it all. Why the Borgias? Why did this name, and not so many other brutal families, come to define the decadence of an era? The answer now lies not in historical events, but in the very psyche of us, the spectators of history. The Borgia myth endures, not because it is entirely true, but because it is a story that is so much better than the truth. And people crave good stories. The truth is, the real crimes of the Borgias, bribery, nepotism, political assassination, were all commonplace among Renaissance rulers. The Sforzas of Milan, the Medicis of Florence, and their enemies the Della Roveres had all indulged in similar intrigue and violence. But the Borgias had something the others lacked, an artistic brazenness. They didn't just commit crimes, they paraded their crimes as a declaration of power. They ripped apart the hypocrisy that society tried to maintain. and that made them the perfect target. They were a blank canvas, and their enemies painted a portrait of evil in the darkest of colors. The most effective weapon was the incest myth. Why was it so powerful? Because it shifted the conversation from the political to the psychological and moral. A pope buying votes was a crime that could be understood. But a pope sleeping with his own daughter was an abomination that violated the natural order. It could not be proven, nor could it be disproven. It struck at the deepest social taboos, transforming the Borgias from sinners to monsters. And once the monster image was established, their every action was interpreted through that lens. Cesare killing Lucrezia's husband? Surely out of sick jealousy. Lucrezia remaining silent? Surely the complicity of the guilty. Ultimately, the Borgia myth survives because it serves a deep human need, the need to see power exposed for its corruption. We have an innate suspicion that those at the top harbor dark secrets. The Borgia story confirms that suspicion perfectly. It gives us a cautionary tale about the dangers of absolute power, that it can corrupt absolutely. It gives us a sick satisfaction in seeing a family, represented by God, living lives more sinister than the most ordinary of people. They become a justification for our cynicism about institutions. And in this great play, Lucrezia becomes the most tragic figure. Her complexities, survivor, mother, protector, have been erased by myth, replaced by the image of a sinister femme fatale. History has no room for complexity. It needs clear symbols. And Lucrezia has been transformed into a symbol of fatal seduction. The truth has been buried because myth is more compelling, more dramatic, and more memorable. The Borgias' ultimate legacy is not the number of enemies they killed or the amount of gold they amassed. Their legacy is this story, a lasting testament to the fact that history is written not just by what happened, but also by what people want to believe happened.